Okay, so now on to the numbers. This first chart shows the overall level of global humanitarian funding. And in the report, we show this while controlling for Haiti, which is the red bit in 2010, the Haiti earthquake response. The reason we do this is the same reason that we have controlled for the Iraq and tsunami responses in the past, just that it's such a major outlier in terms of the money it raised that it can skew the picture. In Haiti, in particular, there was this unprecedented surge of particularly private funding, which then disappears from the system in the next year. So if you look at just the blue bars, that shows you that sort of a baseline trend, if you will. This is, you can see that humanitarian funding continues to rise kind of consistently over time, even without the big spike that Haiti creates. And it also continues to rise as a percentage of global GDP. What's interesting we found is that the overall bottom line of humanitarian funds in the system so far does not seem to be affected by the global financial crisis and recession that began in 2008. We were researching the pilot in 2009, and what we kept hearing from agencies and donors was that we haven't felt the squeeze yet, but it's coming. But then that's the same thing we heard in this round. We're okay for now, but we expect cuts in the future. So far, the numbers don't show it. Humanitarian growth in terms of both money and personnel has slowed a bit in the past 2 years, but it still is moving upward. And this may speak to how many donors have been able to insulate their humanitarian budgets, even while development aid is being cut. But I guess we'll see in the next few years what happens. Overall, what we've learned from the financial analysis is that there haven't really been any dramatic changes from what we saw in the previous period. The DAC donors continue to provide the bulk of humanitarian contributions, and they actually even increased their relative share in the past 2 years. However, the funding base does continue to diversify, and in 2010 you saw the non-traditional or emerging donors reach 158, which is twice what it was 10 years ago. And then, of course, private funding has become important. It rose fivefold, and it's very important and interesting to track private funding, but as we saw with Haiti, it does rise and fall around the massive and sudden onset natural disasters. So it's not sort of a predictable line. And then, of course, the multilateral channel is widening too, with more contributions to the SURF and the country-level common humanitarian funds and emergency response funds. So all these diversifying trends continue, but at the bottom, it's still a system dominated by bilateral humanitarian grants, by DAC donors, led by ECHO and US as the largest two donors. So that's just a breakdown of the human and financial resources of the major implementers. The figures in the left column are the total expenditures. That's money that's spent on humanitarian activities exclusively in the field by the NGOs, UN agencies, and the Red Cross entities. It's not useful to total that column because, as we know, a lot of the UN expenditure goes through NGOs, so there'd be some double counting there. But on the right, you see the numbers of staff. So these are field workers specifically working on humanitarian programs. And the total there for the population of humanitarian aid workers is roughly 274,000 for 2010. And as I said, growth continues. It slowed in 2010, but it's still in the upward direction. So just a side note on the organizational mapping. Through the course of this research, we have built a rather large database of operational organizations. We've got around 4,400 on there at the moment, most of which are national organizations. And we plan to put this all online along with the basic data that we have for them. So budgets, where they're available, staff numbers, country of origin, sector of focus, and a few other things. And the hope is that other researchers and the agencies themselves will find it useful to have a comprehensive list and a searchable database of organizations, and that they will help us to flesh out the database by inputting into it and filling in missing pieces of information and correcting. So it's not live yet. We're still working on it. The name is NGO list, for lack of imagination, and that's the expected URL there, and we hope to have it live by August. Now, when you look at the totality of the aid organization population, what's striking is that it's so thoroughly dominated by such a small number of giants. And you have these 5 largest NGOs, these are the ones with the largest humanitarian spend, making up 38% of it. And then if you widen it out to the top 25, that's then the majority of humanitarian dollars spent. So, and this is among thousands. So it really doesn't make sense to conceive of the NGOs as this populous mass of small actors. You really have to acknowledge the impact and the influence of some of these larger organizations. Some of them outspend or outnumber the UN in certain cases. That said, there's also interesting developments going on in the South, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, what some have called the rise of the Ngos, the Southern International NGOs. And here you have organizations, NGOs like BRAC in Bangladesh, which is now, I think, the largest Southern NGO in the world, has its own bank, it's huge. And smaller ones like Mercy Malaysia, who began as local organizations and then expanded their programming to national, then regional, and then to global. All the while leveraging regional capacities, doing a lot of cooperation with other Southern NGOs, at the same time keeping a close eye on international institutions and coordination mechanisms. And then host governments and regional organizations are also playing more important roles. Governments have increased, well, we've seen an increase in the numbers of the NDMAs, the National Disaster Management Authorities, and the strength of these bodies, and also new national legislation on emergency management. And they've been making their weight felt within the international community, and there has to be some adaptation there. And